did Coach Miller actually have a Coach Miller in his life, like a lot of the people you've influenced at Bloom, at Cal Poly, at all the various locations? But was there a Coach Miller in Coach Miller's life?
No, that's really a great question and a very meaningful question, Pete.
We have Coach Miller here on the line, Coach Steve Miller, and I want to welcome to a new program called Coach Steve Miller's Unlikely Journey. So today we're going to actually talk about generations, the various generations. It's been on my mind. I've been wanting to ask him, as I've been wanting to ask him a lot of questions, which we're going to actually capture. But Coach Miller, good to hear you. Good to see you. Good to hear from you. Why don't you just say hello to our audience here?
I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Peter, and hello. I'm always anxious to do these little interviews, and our interaction is always interesting. So thank you for having me.
Very good. So let's get down to business and start chopping wood. So in terms of generations, what was the significance of your parents' generation and your parents, and how they influence you? And can you share some stories about that? And if you want to throw in some grandparents' stories, that would be great too.
Well, my grandparents, my grandfather, my mother's father, lived with us the last several years of his life. So I didn't spend a lot of time with him. He was a immigrant from the Ukraine, and a very interesting guy. And of course, as he got older and older, he would tell me the same stories over and over again. So it was always interesting, and I always took time to sit with him and visit. I always enjoyed it. In fact, one time, one story that stuck in my mind forever. Suzanne, my wife of 51 years, and I were dating, and we were over at my house, and it was the moon landing, and it was the day of the moon landing, and we were watching TV downstairs in our basement, and they talked about getting out of the spacecraft and walking on the moon, et cetera. So my grandfather came down and walked outside of the basement and said, "Stephen, come on out here." And I did. And he looked up at the sky and he said, "That moon?" And I said, "Yeah, Pa, that moon." He said, "You Americans will believe anything." So I said, "Yeah, that's how he looked at it." You got to remember, he fought in World War I, and they were at that time, airplanes were shooting at each other with guns, pistols, not the automatic weapons and so forth. So his life was interesting and influenced me in the sense that he told me great stories, and I had not traveled a lot prior to that, so his stories were really interesting to me. As far as my parents were concerned, it was an interesting time. Number one is my father was not a laborer, but he was a guy who fixed the old flipper games, the games you play that you put your quarter in or whatever it is, and the steel ball comes down and you've got flippers on either side, and at that time none of that was didn't have the technology they have today, so they had these big boards inside of the machines that had all these circuits on it, and my father would carry around his equipment in an ammunition box that he had from World War II. And he would go into these bars and bowling alleys and other places and fix their machines and collect their money, et cetera, et cetera. And it was in a pretty tough part of the city. And we had some interesting experiences with that. I would go with him on Sundays to work. And one Sunday, we were on this place on 67th and Cottage Grove, which if anybody knows Chicago would know immediately it was a tough place. And we're leaving this bar and getting ready to go to the car. And we heard what we thought were gunshots. I was just a little kid, but we weren't sure. And then the wood fairly close to us, not super close, splintered. and we realized there was gunshots. So my father grabbed me, and we ducked into a hallway, in a building, in an apartment building. And when we jumped into the hallway, there was someone there that had jumped in before us, and it was a police officer. And my father said, "Aren't you supposed to be out there?" And he said something to the effect of, "For $7,000 a year, I'm not getting killed. That's not my deal." So the influence my father had on me was really one of an extraordinarily hardworking, really great family man, and someone who never went to college, graduated from high school, but was really well read. He loved Shakespeare. He loved all those things he didn't have that he was interested in finding out about. So he was a pretty prolific reader. And, he would share stories with me and talk to me about things, but he never was able to come and watch me play any games. And I was an athlete of sorts. And my mother, who did not graduate from high school and was, had kind of a tough time with reading and writing, but she was a fabulous mother, and she affected my life in a lot of different ways. And she was tough. She never had too many good things to say about people that weren't in our family. It was always something that, they weren't as good as we were, or whatever the case was. But she was a housewife. She had 2 children that she loved very much. She had a husband that worked all day and sometimes in the evening. And we spent a lot of time with her. I did, and my brother, who has since passed away. So my mother had a big influence on me. And it was interesting because the story that's most profound to me is that I was giving a speech someplace, and I really can't remember when, but it was the first time I had said this. I had said that I'm overwhelmed by the fact that, first of all, I'm speaking. When I was a child, I was not very outgoing. I was a little bit afraid of my own shadow. And here I am speaking in front of hundreds, and maybe in some cases thousands of people, and talking about, everything from time management to leadership to, how one approaches success and failure, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, it's interesting. My mother had such a tremendous influence on me, and she could barely read and write. And here I am speaking, and I feel in some way I'm speaking on her behalf because I learned so many things from her. That it was really emotional for me right at that moment. And then it kind of became a part of every one of my presentations was the fact that you never know where your education will come from, and how you'll be educated. Sometimes it's stories from friends, sometimes it's experiences, sometimes it's historical, but there's a whole series of things that occur. And, I lived in a post-World War II, era. It was an interesting time, but we lived in an apartment, a 1-bedroom apartment, 5 of us. 3 of us lived in my father's brother, myself and my brother would share a bedroom with 2 beds in it. One of us would sleep on the floor for a month, and then the other 2 would be in bed, and then we would change. So you actually slept in a bed for 2 months and on the floor for 1 month. And my parents, we didn't have another bedroom, but they had an in-the-door bed. We called it I think they have another name for it now, but at the time we called it an in-the-door bed. And you opened these doors and you pulled the bed down, and you had to move the furniture from the front room. We had a party line for our telephones. So there was no such thing as just picking up a phone and having a private conversation. There obviously was no social media. There was obviously no, you had a typewriter, not a computer, and you used payphones everywhere you went. There was payphones. So I learned a lot of lessons from that period of time, but most of the lessons were about family, loving families, and how hard it was to make a buck, and difficult times required, people that were not afraid to work, not afraid to use their hands, and, not afraid to do other things. And of course, because my parents didn't have a formal education, my father in particular, was had learned his craft in the Navy. And when he got out, he applied it to becoming this guy who fixed these machines. Later in his life, he started a company called Miller Coin and Williams Coin. His name was William Miller, which put us on the other side where we now owned some places. And it was an interesting time, but learned a ton from the two of them, even though we never really sat down and talked about education or talked about, what can your life be? It wasn't those kind of conversations. The conversations were more personal and they were more family directed. We always ate dinner together. Those were the things I remember most. And there was not a lot of saying I love you or hugging. It just wasn't that era. And it was a different kind of era. But I can honestly say that the vast majority of things that I learned from them and their friends who were going through the same kind of lifestyle. And it was interesting, but it was a generational thing. It started out in the 40s. I was born in September of 1943. And it carried on through the time I went off to college, which was, 18 years later, 19 years later. So I spent a lot of time with them, didn't travel very much, only went downtown to Chicago a couple of times, because at that time you lived in your neighborhood and your neighborhood was your world and your life. And I thought it was great. I didn't know that we were poor. I didn't know that people had private phones. I didn't know that there were apartments that were 3-4 bedrooms and that people always had their own beds. And I never wanted any of those things because they never occurred to me as being important. And then later in life, you're taught a whole series of different lessons, and things change. So.
No, that was good. Would it be okay to ask, what was your mother's name, Coach Miller?
Her name was Faye Miller. Her maiden name was Cabin, Cabin. And a lot of people called her Faye, Faye, and some people called her Fannie, Fannie. She was a great mother, just a great mother, just protective and incredibly tough. She was just a wonderful woman. She died very, very young. She was in her 40s. She had breast cancer, and at that time, breast cancer was a terminal illness, and she passed away. And I remember going to the hospital on a day when I realized that this was the last day I was ever going to see her. She had lost an enormous amount of weight, and all they could do is keep her comfortable, but the cancer ate her up, and she passed away. So
No,
it was a
thank you.
tough time.
No, and again, with your grandfather, was his name Steve? Were you named after him?
No, my grandfather's his last name was Cabin, and Morris was his first name.
Morris.
I can't believe I almost didn't remember his name was Morris, because I only called him Pa. PA. That was it. Pa. How are you doing, Pa? What's going on, Pa? He was great. He was just a great guy. He had his passport from being in Russia. He lived in Kiev, just outside of Kiev, in the Ukraine, but he was Russian, and he was captured in the army and walked across the Siberian Siberia, which is, as most people that know that part of the world, an incredibly cold, freezing place, like being in the North Pole. And to escape, he actually walked across that entire area, which made up about 3/4 of Russia. And he escaped, and then was able to come to the U.S. and brought his family. And he just brought his wife. My mother was born in the United States, and my father was born in the United States. My father's mother was institutionalized when she was a fairly young woman. She had 3 children from 3 different fathers, and she had mental illness, and she was institutionalized. And of course, during that period of time also, they weren't very sophisticated in their treatment. And the whole idea of treatment of mental illness at that particular time was keeping them quiet, keeping them out of harm's way. There was talk of lobotomies at that particular time in history. It was, which is, just deadening the brain. It was interesting. I went to see her a couple of times, I was young and I didn't really understand, why she was there. And we talked, but she was schizophrenic. And as a result, her conversations would kind of float in and float out. So I had little or no contact with her. So my grandfather was the person that I had the most contact with and learned the most from. And he was great. I could tell you 100 stories. I'll tell you one that was, again, relatively funny. I was teaching high school in Chicago Heights at Bloom High School, and I would come home every day. We were still living in Chicago, and I would come home and I would sit and we'd have dinner, and I would complain sometimes about the school day. And one time I was complaining about the fact that a lot of the kids in our school, when the bell rang for the start of class, a lot of kids did not go to their class. They were just walking around the halls. And it was a pretty tough environment. And my grandfather said, why don't you just mount a machine gun at the end of the hall, and then simultaneously with the bell ringing, just open fire, and who's ever there in the hallway will get killed. And then the next day, I don't think you'll have the same problems. So that was his way of solving issues.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. I'm sure you get this question all the time, but who do you think you were more like? Your mom, your dad, both? None of the above?
I think I was more like, really a lot more like my mom. I mean, I spent a lot of time with her, and my father and I did not spend as much time as I'd like. Actually, we spent a lot more time together as he got older, and as I became an adult and so forth and so on. But during my childhood, my mother was the cornerstone of our family, and she was the person. She was the first person that told me that arguing was not a sin. You could argue if you want. She was the first person that told me that you should always stick up for yourself. She was more likely to tell me that I should hit back if somebody hit me, where my father would say, maybe you should negotiate and discuss it. My mother was not having any of that, but much more like my mother. She was really a character, and she was a very funny person. She had a great sense of humor, and people loved being around her. But she really suffered in her last several years, and it was a shame to see such a vibrant person going through that. What she went through with cancer. Today, it's equally bad, obviously, but breast cancer is not quite the killer it was before. Things are a lot different, and treatment was different. So. But my mother was really something. I really, to be honest, Pete, I really don't think about my parents all that often, because I'm the kind of person, when I have an experience that is not positive, or something was difficult, I kind of rationalize it out of my mind to some degree. So when I do think of her, I think of her, with a great deal of, admiration and love and appreciation. But I like to think of her as the way I remember her, not as the way she was when she passed away. I try to, block that out as much as I can. I try to remember her as, this vibrant, engaging person. So, and of course, I'm 77, and she passed away in her early 40s. So it's been, a long time. It's been a long time. So.
And Coach Miller, that was very touching. Thank you for sharing that. And I can tell it was from the heart, and I know a lot of people appreciate it. So if we move on to the next generation, which was the generation you grew up with, and you called it post-World War II, what do you think you learned, from your own generation that you can share with your audience?
Well, I think, again, it was still a tough time. The 40s and 50s, were not the best time economically. People were, struggling, to make a living, et cetera, et cetera. And I went to a grade school, Volta Grade School, which was less than 2 blocks from my house. And we had a big, giant gravel play area there. I mean, it was like a soccer field, not quite a soccer field size, but it was covered with pebbles, these white pebbles. There was no grass, there was no, nothing was cut out. And I and my friends that I grew up with, would go there until we were called to come home. After school, we would just go there and play. We would do everything from race, to play softball, which was a city game, a Chicago game, not hardball, but a softball, 16-inch softball, big ball. We would do everything and anything. And I grew up with a group of people that were interesting. We had a couple of Japanese students at the school. And as people know, Japanese were interned at a particular period of time. They were put in prisons or they were put in different locations because they were the enemy during World War II. And some of those people moved to the area I lived in, and we went to school with those young people and who were trying to adjust to life in the United States. A lot of first generation Americans, lots and lots of them, Greeks, Italians, Poles, a lot of them. So the kids that I grew up with, frequently their parents didn't speak English, or if they did, it was only to a certain extent. And what was interesting, what always stuck in my mind, were the things people would bring to school to eat lunch. I mean, I remember the first time I saw somebody eating snails, and he would have a bag of snails, and he would have a safety pin, and he put the safety pin in, pull the snail out, and eat it. And I thought, oh my God! I mean, who is this guy? What is this about? And fortunately, I was in an area that was very diverse, and fortunately, crime was not a big issue. I'm sure it was bigger than I thought, but there was no communication like there is now with social media. So I learned a lot of things. I learned how to play. I learned what fair treatment was in terms of a diverse group of people. It was a great time to be a kid because your families were relatively small and your parents paid so much attention to you. You were generally the first generation going to school, and that was interesting. So so the generation was really fascinating, and I didn't know about racism and those things. We did not have any Black kids in school. We did have Hispanics. So I didn't get that diverse feeling other than when I went to work with my father on Sundays, because he worked in a neighborhood that was in neighborhoods that were extremely diverse. And I had lots of experiences with diversity at that time. So my childhood was really a great time. I mean, the difference between me now and then was I hardly ever spoke. I was a very, 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 very shy person in front of adults in particular. I was afraid of my own shadow most of the time. I was just a kid and acted like a kid, I guess, and didn't have a lot of self-confidence. I could always run and I could always do certain things that made me a little bit better than some of the people I grew up with athletically. Was not into school very heavily, was never really emotionally into school until I got into college, and even then not until my second year of college. And then I went to a high school. When I was getting ready to go to high school, my family moved, and I was 14 years old, and we moved to a little bit better part of Chicago. And I ended up going to Amundsen High School, which was a extraordinarily diverse school with great, interestingly enough, great facilities. It was kind of like the school in the middle of the city, where the city spent a lot of money building a stadium, a small football stadium, outdoor cinder track, lots of soccer fields. When I was a kid on Sunday, when I didn't go to work with my father, we would go to Amundsen fields, and there would be 10 or 15 soccer games. And the family all had their little seats that they sat in, the little folding chairs. And you have to remember, all of those people were first generation Americans. So I was introduced to soccer before I was introduced to any other sport. Soccer was the sport, and we could never figure out why the US didn't play soccer. And of course, it didn't catch on for decades, after that. But I remember playing and watching it all the time, because that was part of our growth. It was great. In sports, to a great extent, just the participation kind of saved me. It gave me an outlet to do things where I could be a little bit more aggressive, where I could get some of my feelings out, et cetera. And sport was a sanctuary for me, to a great extent. And not only participation as an athlete, but participation just being with people that I enjoyed being around, and just the camaraderie of it, and the whole entire dynamic of being on the team or being with friends and playing games. It was great. I remember much later in my life being in Africa and watching young kids play soccer in particular, in other games, and played just for the joy of it. Sometimes wouldn't even keep score. They just played for the joy of it. There was something primordial about running and jumping and throwing and the activities of a kid. And I saw the same joy in their eyes when I was in Nigeria, Kenya, and the Ivory Coast that I saw when I was in Chicago and at Volta High School, or Volta Grade School, and Amundsen High School, and then later Niles High School. It was interesting. So after 2 years of high school at Amundsen, my family moved again, and they moved to the suburbs, which was the natural progression for a middle class, lower to middle class person, if you could. That was the American dream. You were born in the city, you try to get in the good neighborhoods, better neighborhoods each time. Then you go to the suburbs, and the suburbs was kind of like making it. And our family bought a home in Skokie, Illinois, and I lived there for several years. Went my last 2 years of high school to Skokie. Unfortunately, I would go back to the city quite a bit, and got in some trouble. And in my senior year of school, my senior year of high school, I spent more time in the Audi home than I did in the high school. So it was a little bit of a perplexing time in my life, because I learned to love Chicago. When I left, I couldn't wait to leave. And when I had left, I couldn't wait to get back. And it was just, confusion. And I was, involved in some street violence and some other things, which continued in the city, but were not around in the suburbs. So it was kind of like living two lives. One was, the city life, and the other one was this suburban life. And, I guess to some extent it confused me, because I wasn't sure which one of those two was better. Even though in the city, lots of my friends went to jail, lots of my friends had problems. And in the suburbs, nobody went to jail. Everybody was just really nice, and it was just a different lifestyle. So, it was fun growing up. I had great experiences, both in grade school, high school, and then finally ended up going to college on kind of a fluke. I probably didn't belong in college, but I did go, and then my second year of school became very, very, very involved in education, where I really loved the whole idea of learning, and realized all the things I had never learned and all the things I didn't know anything about. And it really started to expand my interest, and also expand my vision of the way the world worked, because it had been so confined for so long in terms of geography, that as the world opened up, it became a completely different place to live in. And it was exciting. It was really exciting. So, high school period of time, I was kind of anywhere between a really nice guy and a bum. I can't remember exactly which took over the most of me, but I think what ended up happening is for those athletes that I coached later on and spent time with, et cetera, I think that they could see a little bit of all of that in me in some way. I mean, I'm sure I had some rough edges for some people, and I'm sure that I also had some compassion for other people. It just depended on the circumstance, and ultimately, I chose the path of more compassion, with a bit of sternness as it related to rules and regulations, and what you did, et cetera, et cetera. But my life both generationally, from my parents to where I ended up when I graduated from college, felt like a very smooth transition. It felt like everything was pretty logical. However, I never planned any of it. So things just happened as they happened. I became interested in education, like I said, when I was a sophomore in college, and that changed a lot of my perspective and time on task and more thinking about academics than I did athletics. I was a good grade school athlete, was kind of an average high school athlete, became a pretty good collegiate athlete. It seemed like I was much more immature when I was younger, and as a result, did not apply myself quite the way I could or should athletically because I didn't have confidence. And then over a period of time, things changed, and they changed because of the experiences. I was really a child of changing societies and changing environments. I mean, you have to remember that I grew up and here I am, working at one of my first jobs, and all of a sudden somebody comes up with the BlackBerry, and then all of a sudden you start seeing other things, and your life changes, and you're watching news from around the world, and it just changed. But to me, it always felt logical. It never felt illogical. It just always felt logical, and I never spent any time, interestingly enough, worrying about what I was going to do when I was an adult. I just never had a plan. I think that the kids that I coached, and who are young men and women, and some old men and women, I think they always felt like they had to have a plan, that they always had to, decide what their major was, where they were going, influence of their families, et cetera, et cetera. I just kind of let it flow. I never really gave in to, I've got to do this, I've got to do that, I've got to make this much money, I've got to do that. For a long time, I took jobs and frankly never knew what I got paid, or never really spent any time negotiating about pay. To me, it was the joy of the work and not, not something else. So it was interesting, that early generation when I was affected by my grandfather and my parents, then that period of time where I was affected by my peers and friends in school. And then I was affected by moving 3 times from the time I started grade school to the time I finished high school, and each of those areas being different. And then going to college and changing yet again. And then the world opening up and seeing things that I had never seen before. It wasn't a standard childhood in the sense that I went through so many phases. There was just a lot of different phases, and I was a subject of each one of those phases. And what it ended up doing for me, Peter, as a total generational issue, was each portion of the generations as I moved forward played a major part in creating my point of view, how I saw the world, how I treated other people, how I became more outgoing, how I became, how I used the language differently. All of those things were lessons that I learned. And frankly, to be honest with you, I remember them all pretty clearly. It's not as if, I may not remember all the names and I may not remember exactly everything, but I remember, going to the principal in grade school and walking down the hallway to the principal's office and saying, looking up at the roof of the building or the ceiling and saying, to God, who I didn't even know existed, I said, God, if you'll just let me out of this, I'll never do it again. I promise I'll never do it again. It seemed like I was always apologizing for something or to somebody. And then later on, because of, because I did well academically, because I started to really do well athletically, that was the beginning of some of the leadership that I learned and some other things. And I know that people that knew me, mostly now have passed away, obviously, but knew me as a young person are astounded that I carry myself the way I do now versus the way I did when I was a kid, because they're so diametrically opposite. Because as I said, I was quiet, I was introverted, I was scared, I was, all of these things, preyed on me. And as I got older, just the world opened up, and I took all of those lessons and then applied them as they applied as I aged.
No, I feel like as I was listening to you, I think there's a question that I think a lot of people who are actually watching this segment of you are probably going to ask, well, did Coach Miller actually have a Coach Miller in his life, like a lot of the people you've influenced at Bloom, at Cal Poly, in all the various locations? But was there one person, and I know you mentioned your grandfather and your father, but was there a Coach Miller in Coach Miller's life?
No, that's really a great question and a very meaningful question, Pete. And I think it leads to exactly why I turned out to a great extent the way I did, because there was no Coach Miller, and I always knew that I wanted there to be that person. I wanted there to be a person that I could look to. I looked to my father, I looked to my mother, but not in the context of my entire life. They were not coaches. We talked, but they were not engaged in my athletic life. They didn't push academics on me. I admired and appreciated both of them, but they were not coaches. They were not that person. I learned through osmosis almost, not intentional. So as I grew and as I took on responsibilities and became more aware and took on leadership roles and coached, I wanted to become that person I never had. And as a result, it blossomed into something much greater than I could ever have had it blossom into. Because I guess there's both sides of the story. One side of the story would tell you, if you had a coach in your life or a person in your life that you admired and took his or her information and applied it later, that would be good. But there's also a downside of that. And the downside is that maybe the lessons they taught you were short of where you feel you could be. Maybe they didn't meet your expectation. Maybe they weren't at the level that you wanted them to be. And I always wanted to be great at something. I always wanted to be special. And as a result, I created my own world, given all the things I had learned from the previous world. And what I did was take all of those lessons and applied them to a life that I led, that led me to, us talking today. And it was a world that I didn't fabricate. It was a world that I just created because I always knew what I wanted and I always knew what I didn't have. And I promised myself that I would give all of those things to anybody I came in contact with. And that is what drove my philosophy of coaching. Besides of which, the first 10 years, especially at Bloom High School, I learned more than I taught. I mean, I learned a lot. And during that period of time, learning what I learned, I applied. And the coach really was not a person. It was a place and a confluence of lots of impressions. And they all culminated with a direction that I went into because I didn't have it. And I wanted other people to have it because I felt I knew what would bring them joy and happiness. And I wanted them to be better than I was. I wanted to solve some of their problems if I could. I'm sure I created some problems also. It was a combination of both, but no, there wasn't that person that I came in contact with. However, I did read. I was a voracious reader for a long time, and read about a lot of people. Everybody that you can imagine that really would strike one's life. But it was the total of those experiences that went into the composition of what I ultimately came out as, and most of it was driven by what I didn't have and what I wanted to have.
Excellent answer. And I know that wasn't on the pre-question, so you nailed it, but I really felt I wanted to ask that, and a lot of
Sure,
people would
sure.
want to know. And, maybe going to another generation, what do you think you learned most from the Cal Poly San Luis Obispo generations? And you can exclude what you learned from me because you probably didn't learn jack from me, but everybody else, Coach, if you had
No,
to say maybe one or two things
yeah.
that you learned from that group of people from 76, let's say to 81, what would you say the one thing you learned from that group?
Well, I think that I learned a lot of things. First of all, let's not forget that I was not a West Coast guy, so my perspectives were all Midwest and East Coast. They were not West Coast, and there is a difference. I mean, there is a difference growing up in Garden Grove and growing up in Milwaukee. I mean, there's a difference. So it took me a little while to adjust to that lifestyle. It took me a little while to adjust to the beauty, to just the physical beauty of the place we were and how fortunate we were to be in such a geographically spectacular place. I mean, you could go down to the ocean to run, you can run on the campus, you can go back into the hills. We didn't have the best facilities, but we had the best environment. We had a great environment. So I learned a lot about that. And then I learned a lot about change because at Cal Poly initially I was not able to recruit the top athletes. I was able to recruit athletes that were good, that were probably more students, but not all of them, obviously. And they wanted to be good, but they weren't the UCLA, USC, Cal person. They were more a Cal Poly person, and there was a personality to that. And to get those young men and women at the time to see the world differently, to all of a sudden start dreaming things that they never dreamt before. I mean, Ivan Huff and Eric Huff, I don't believe that either one of them went to the state high school championships. Now they may have, but they certainly weren't state champions, and they certainly weren't in the finals. I mean, I only recruited people like that years later, 2, 3 years later, when we really got good. So we had guys. I was just looking up the other day, and I was thinking about Ronnie Waynes. And the reason I was thinking about him is because his son just got traded to, I don't know, he was at Minnesota. He was a top draft choice in football, played defensive back. I think he was drafted third or fourth in the first round. He was a great, great player. And he just got traded to someone. So I was thinking about Ronnie, and I went back into trying to find some results of the track meets that we ran in. And Ron Waynes was like a 20-foot high school long jumper. And in one of the meets we were in, he jumped 26 feet. I mean, it was different. And, people started doing things that they never thought they could do. And the thing that I learned at Cal Poly is that success was viral. That if you were in a successful environment, you could pass that success on, and people's expectations rose so dramatically that if you didn't rise with it, you were left behind. So the team aspect of it and the success of it, the outcome was organic. It helped each individual and thereby helped the team. So I learned a tremendous amount about the cohesiveness of a team, how you spoke to a little bit of an older athlete because they were now college athletes and not high school athletes. I just learned a whole new vision of things. And you have to remember, Pete, the first year I was there, we bought some uniforms, green and gold uniforms with they were just ugly. They were terrible. And I thought they were really pretty cool. And over a period of time, I realized a lot about a lot of things. And I remember going to our first couple of meets when I was at Cal Poly, and we would check into hotels, and our guys never felt great about themselves. I mean, it didn't happen in year one. It happened in year 2, 3, and 4, or 3, 4, and 5. That's when it happened. But the expectations for us were minimal, and that minimal expectation became profound throughout the entire team and the culture. And I knew I had to change that. And I knew I had to find a way to make everybody believe that they could be better than they thought possible, and that reaching for that goal would become infectious. So I learned the value of not only the physical aspect of success, but the psychological aspect of success. So it was all about, we were doing cognitive learning, recognition learning, before it became as popular as it is now. We were talking about how you feel about yourself. What do you think about, can you win? Are you good enough? Have you put in the time? And you're surrounded by people that had no question about what they were, they were going to be successful. It was just going to be fine. I was looking at, when I was looking at those results, I remember looking at the Pat Croft, a guy ran 46.0 in the 400 meters. I mean, he was a good athlete, but not a great athlete. Tim McDonald, ended up pole vaulting 18 or 17 feet in a period of time when he was, in fact, he may have gone 18 feet, but at a period of time when he was, when being a 15-foot pole vaulter was really good. It was just unbelievable. The whole thing was magical. And it taught me a lot, but it taught me a lot more about psychology than it did about physiology. And I always said that if all you learn to do is run and jump, then I haven't taught you very much. But if you learned other things, then it was a whole different deal.
No, Coach Miller, I've said numerous times the one thing that I had privilege of is your first year was my first year, and your last year was my last year. So I saw the beginnings, and some of those stories I know you don't want to talk about anymore, but the middle portion of it and the number of stories that come along with what I witnessed from 76 to 81 was incredible, and the story continues. And Coach Miller, I got a bunch of other questions, but we're running out of time, but let's do this again, okay?
Sure, 100%.
And it was good. Me too. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get another subject for we could talk about. I'll talk about at the end of this, but thank you so much for your time. Again, this is going to go on the Coach Steve Miller's, what did I say?
Unlikely journey.
Unlikely journey. I think that's great. So Coach Miller, I'm going to wrap this up and say goodbye to the audience. I know everybody's going to enjoy this content. So with that,
thank you very much. Thanks.
Next time.
Look forward to it.